There is a 3-story Victorian mansion in Golden, Colorado that does not belong among the pristine residential boulevards where American industrial aristocracy typically builds its palaces. It stands within breathing distance of factory smokestacks and fermentation vats, surrounded by loading docks and railroad sidings, built by a German immigrant who had everything money could buy except the ability to separate work from life, power from family, control from love. This is the story of the Coors family mansion, not the sanitized corporate legend about bootstraps and American opportunity, but the darker, more complicated tale of how a house became a prison, how discipline hardened into pathology, and how 3 generations lived inside a fortress that fed on the very empire it was meant to protect them from. This building was constructed in 1891 on the grounds of the Adolph Coors Brewing Company. Not near the brewery. On the brewery grounds, the mansion's heating pipes ran directly from the factory's boiler system. The children of privilege fell asleep each night to the mechanical rhythm of bottling lines and the sweet, cloying smell of fermenting grain. They ate breakfast in silence while their grandfather watched workers through the window like a general surveying troops. And one of those children, raised in this strange hybrid of home and industrial compound, would drive away from this mansion on a February morning in 1960 and vanish from a bridge near Morrison, Colorado, leaving behind only blood, broken glasses, and an idling car. If you value deep investigations into American dynasties, the architecture of control, and the invisible psychological cages that wealth constructs around its inheritors, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these detailed explorations possible. Now, let us enter the mansion where Adolph Coors III learned the family business, where silence reigned at dinner, and where the boundary between empire and family dissolved completely. 1. The penniless stowaway who built an empire on paranoia. The mansion's story begins in 1868 with a young man committing a crime. Adolph Herman Joseph Coors, the original, the patriarch, the founder, did not buy passage to America. He stowed away. 21 years old, an orphan from Prussia, trained as a brewer's apprentice since age 14. No family, no money, no ticket, just technical knowledge and an almost pathological determination to control his own fate. He hid in the cargo hold of a ship crossing the Atlantic, survived on stolen food and brackish water, and arrived in New York Harbor as an illegal immigrant. This detail matters. The man who would build a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars began by breaking the law, by trusting no institution, and by relying solely on his own cunning. This was not romantic. This was survival mathematics. Adolph worked whatever jobs would have him: gardener, stonecutter, brickmaker, fireman. He moved west, following the gravitational pull of opportunity that drew millions to the frontier territories. He did not search for gold like the desperate prospectors clogging Colorado's mountain passes. He searched for water, pure, mineral-rich water. The kind of water that German brewing science required for proper Pilsner-style beer. And in 1873, he found it, Golden, Colorado, a dusty supply town at the base of the Rocky Mountains, named not for precious metal, but for Thomas Golden, an early prospector. Clear Creek ran through the center of town, fed by snowmelt from the peaks. Adolph tasted the water. He understood immediately. The mineral composition was nearly perfect: low alkalinity, high purity. This was the chemical foundation for beer that could compete with the great European breweries. But knowledge means nothing without capital. Adolph had saved $2,000 from years of manual labor, an impressive sum for an immigrant laborer, but nowhere near sufficient to build a brewery. He needed a partner. He found Jacob Schuler, a local businessman who owned a successful grocery and mercantile operation. Schuler had money. Adolph had expertise. They formed the Schuler and Coors Golden Brewery in 1873. The initial investment was approximately $20,000, with Schuler providing $18,000 and Adolf contributing $2,000 plus his brewing knowledge. The contract terms were crucial. Adolf insisted on total control of production. Schuler would handle finances and distribution, but every decision about recipe, quality, and manufacturing process belonged to Adolf alone. This was the seed of the control obsession that would define the Coors dynasty for the next century. The brewery succeeded immediately. Adolf's beer was exceptional. He used only barley malt, hops, water, and yeast. No rice, no corn, no adjuncts. In an era when American beer was often adulterated with cheap fillers, Coors brewed something approaching European standards. Colorado miners and railroad workers could taste the difference. Demand grew. And then Adolf made his second defining move. In 1880, just 7 years after founding the partnership, he bought out Jacob Schuler completely. The exact purchase price is not recorded in surviving documents, but Schuler left the business and Adolf became sole owner. No partners, no board of directors, no investors, complete autonomy. This was not merely a business preference. This was ideological. Adolf Coors had fled Europe to escape dependency and poverty. Now, in Colorado, he would build something that answered to no one but himself. His business philosophy crystallized into an iron rule: no debt, ever. Most American breweries of the 1880s and 1890s expanded through bank loans and investor capital. They grew quickly, leveraging borrowed money to build larger facilities and capture market share. Adolf refused. Every piece of equipment, every expansion, every barrel was purchased with cash from profits. If the brewery did not have the money, the purchase did not happen. This made growth slower, but rendered the business nearly invulnerable to the financial panics that periodically swept through the American economy. When banks failed and credit dried up in 1893, destroying countless businesses, Adolf Coors Brewing Company continued operating without interruption. Adolf was building a fortress, not just a business but a self-sufficient economic entity that could withstand any external shock. This fortress mentality would extend to every aspect of his life, including where and how he lived. By 1890, Adolf Coors was wealthy by any measure. The brewery was producing thousands of barrels annually. Distribution extended across Colorado and into neighboring territories. He could have built a mansion on Capitol Hill in Denver, where Colorado's mining barons and railroad magnates were constructing elaborate Victorian homes designed to broadcast status. Adolf did the opposite. He decided to build his family residence on the brewery property itself, not near the brewery. On it, within sight and smell and sound of production. This decision was so unusual that it requires explanation. Wealthy industrialists of the Gilded Age universally separated their domestic lives from their factories. Andrew Carnegie did not live next to his steel mills. John D. Rockefeller did not sleep within earshot of his refineries. The point of wealth was escape from labor, from the working class, from the grime and noise of industry. Adolf Coors rejected this, deliberately. He wanted no separation. The business was not something he did. It was what he was. And his family would be integrated into this system, whether they wished it or not. In 1891, construction began on the mansion that would house 3 generations of Coors heirs. 2. The architecture of control, a house that breathed factory. Heir. The Coors mansion was designed in the Queen Anne Victorian style, Aoski's fashionable architectural mode characterized by asymmetry, decorative trim, bay windows, and multiple textures. The exterior combined red brick with Colorado sandstone accents. The roofline was complex, with steep gables and decorative shingles. It was, by conventional standards, a beautiful building. approximately 8,000 square feet across 3 floors, with a tower room providing panoramic views of the surrounding valley. But beauty obscures function, and the function of this house was surveillance. From the 2nd floor master bedroom and adjoining office, Adolf could observe the entire brewery yard. The window placement was deliberate. He could see the main production building, the loading docks where wagons arrived to collect finished kegs, the employee entrance where workers clocked in for shifts, the rail siding where freight cars were loaded. Nothing happened on brewery grounds that could not be observed from the patriarch's private rooms. This created a psychological environment unique among American industrial families. The workers knew they were watched, not by hired managers or foremen, but by the owner himself, whose home overlooked their labor. There was no escape from his gaze. This was panopticon architecture applied to capitalism. The prisoners were employees. The warden lived in a mansion that functioned as a watchtower. But the surveillance worked in both directions. The family was equally trapped. The mansion's heating system was connected directly to the brewery's central boiler via underground pipes. This was technically elegant. It eliminated the need for a separate residential furnace and utilized waste heat from beer production. But it created physical dependency. If the brewery stopped operating, the house would go cold. The family's comfort was literally a byproduct of industrial output. You could not heat the mansion without brewing beer. The umbilical cord was made of iron pipe and steam. The smell was inescapable. Fermenting. Grain produces a distinctive odor, sweet, yeasty, organic. It is not unpleasant in small doses, but it is pervasive. It saturated the mansion's walls, carpets, drapes, and furniture. The Coors children grew up breathing air that smelled perpetually of malt and hops. They could not separate their home environment from the industrial process generating their wealth. Olfactory memory is powerful. For the rest of their lives, the smell of beer would mean home, and home would mean work, and work would mean father. Inside, the mansion was decorated with imported European furniture, heavy oak pieces, straight-back chairs that discouraged slouching, dark wood paneling that absorbed light rather than reflected it. The aesthetic was German, solid, functional, built to last. There was no frivolity, no delicate ornamentation, nothing that suggested leisure or pleasure for its own sake. Every room communicated the same message: discipline. The dining room was the psychological center of the Ossazo house. Meals were conducted in absolute silence. Adolf Coors established this rule and enforced it without compromise. No conversation, no questions, no laughter. Family members sat at a long table, Adolf at the head, and ate without speaking. The only sounds were silverware against porcelain and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. If a child attempted to speak, Adolf would stare until the child stopped. No words were necessary. His displeasure was expressed through silence and eye contact. Why? Adolf never explained, but the effect was clear. Speech became associated with transgression. Expression became dangerous. Children learned to internalize everything: thoughts, feelings, complaints, questions. They learned to eat their food and ask nothing. This training would shape their adult personalities in profound ways. Adolf Coors III, the future kidnapping victim, grew up in this dining room. He learned to be quiet. He learned to hide emotion. He learned that vulnerability was unacceptable. But Adolf the Patriarch was not a simple tyrant. He contained contradictions that revealed the psychological complexity beneath his iron exterior. He maintained a winter garden, a greenhouse attached to the mansion's southern wall. Inside this greenhouse, Adolf cultivated roses, not as a business, as a hobby. He spent hours among the flowers, pruning and tending and selecting varieties. He invested significant money in acquiring rare rose types from European growers. This was the only context in which Adolf touched something with tenderness. His hands, which signed termination notices and enforced factory discipline without hesitation, handled rose petals with extraordinary care. The contrast was jarring. The man who demanded silence from his children whispered to flowers. The man who fired workers for minor infractions spent hours nurturing fragile blooms that would die in a week. This suggests deep emotional suppression, a sentimentalism that Adolf considered weakness and allowed himself to express only toward non-human objects. His family received discipline. His roses received love. The psychological damage this inflicted on his children is incalculable. The mansion also housed Adolf's private office, separate from the brewery's administrative building. This office contained his personal financial records, correspondence, and business ledgers. Adolf kept meticulous accounts. Every transaction was recorded by hand. He trusted no bookkeeper completely. His paranoia about financial control extended to the smallest details. He wanted to know where every dollar came from and where every dollar went. This obsessive record-keeping would later provide historians with an unusually complete picture of Coors' finances. But it also reveals a man who could not delegate, could not trust, and could not rest. The mansion's construction cost was approximately $75,000, roughly equivalent to $2.3 million. Today, this was an enormous sum, but Adolf paid in cash. No mortgage, no loans. The house, like the brewery, was owned outright from the moment construction finished. Debt remained the enemy. And yet, despite the wealth, despite the mansion, despite the empire, Adolf Coors remained an outsider. Denver society did not fully accept him. He was a German immigrant in an era of rising Anglo-American nativism. He was a brewer in a country increasingly influenced by temperance advocates who viewed alcohol as moral poison. He lacked the pedigree of East Coast industrialists. His mansion was attached to a factory, an arrangement Denver's mining barons found gauche. Adolf did not care, or claimed not to. But the exclusion stung. Money could buy a house. Money could buy a business. Money could not buy acceptance from people who viewed themselves as culturally superior. This wound, the wound of the excluded outsider, would be passed to the second generation, and the second generation would attempt to heal it through marriage. 3. The son who brought culture and the bride who brought class. In 1893, Adolf Coors II was born inside the mansion on the brewery grounds. He was the oldest son, the designated heir. From birth, his life was predetermined. He would attend university. He would study engineering or chemistry. He would return to Golden. He would work in the brewery. He would eventually take control. There was no other option. This was not discussed or negotiated. It was simply understood. Adolf II accepted this destiny without visible resistance. He was a quieter personality than his father, less abrasive, less overtly authoritarian, but equally committed to the business. In 1914, he enrolled at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, to study chemical engineering. This was significant. Cornell was an elite institution. Adolf I had never attended university. He learned brewing through apprenticeship. Adolf II would combine practical knowledge with formal, scientific training. This represented upward social mobility through education. Cornell also exposed Adolf II to a world radically different from Golden, Colorado. East Coast intellectual culture, urban sophistication, students from wealthy established families whose fortunes predated the Civil War. Adolf II was smart and capable, but he was also the son of a German immigrant brewer from a frontier town. The social hierarchy was subtle, but real. Old money looked down on new money, and beer money specifically carried a working-class taint that no amount of wealth could fully erase. But at Cornell, Adolf II met someone who would change the trajectory of the Coors family, Alice May Kistler. Alice was the daughter of Dr. Burton E. Kistler, a respected physician and academic. Her family had roots in Pennsylvania's professional class. She was educated, cultured, articulate. She wrote poetry. She read literature. She moved through elite social circles with ease. And she was beautiful. Adolf II was, by multiple accounts, immediately smitten. Their courtship was relatively brief. They married in 1915, shortly after Adolf II completed his degree. He was 22, she was 21. They returned to Golden, where Alice entered the mansion on the brewery grounds and confronted a way of life utterly alien to her upbringing. Alice Kistler Coors was not prepared for the reality of life inside Adolf Thurn's fortress. The mansion was comfortable in material terms. It had modern plumbing, electric lighting, and expensive furnishings. But it lacked warmth. Adolf III was 77 years old when Alice arrived. He was set in his routines. Meals remained silent. The house remained subordinate to the brewery's schedule. Workers' shifts dictated household rhythms. The smell of fermentation permeated everything. And Adolf IV, though aging, remained firmly in control. Alice responded by attempting to create a separate cultural sphere within the house. She established a library. She hosted small gatherings of educated friends from Denver. She encouraged conversation and intellectual exchange, everything Adolf Thur's silence rule had suppressed. This created tension, not open conflict, but a cold war over the mansion's atmosphere. Adolf I viewed Alice's intellectualism with suspicion. She was too educated, too opinionated, too independent. But she was also the mother of his grandchildren, and Adolf II was devoted to her. So Adolf I tolerated her presence while refusing to accommodate her preferences. Alice gave birth to 4 children in relatively quick succession. Adolf III was born in 1916, William in 1918, Joseph in 1920, and a daughter, May-Louise, in 1923. The mansion filled with the sounds of children, sounds Adolf I found disruptive and irritating. The grandfather, who tended roses with gentleness, showed little affection toward his grandchildren. They were expected to be quiet, obedient, and unobtrusive. Their needs were met materially, but not emotionally. Adolf III, the future kidnapping victim, was the oldest male grandchild, and therefore the next designated heir. From early childhood, he understood his role. He would inherit the brewery after his father. This was not presented as a possibility or a choice. It was destiny. And destiny began with observation. As soon as Adolf III was old enough to walk, he was brought into the brewery to watch, to learn, to absorb. The child grew up in the shadow of 2 very different parental figures. Adolf II was competent but reserved, a man who fulfilled his duties without apparent passion. Alice was warm and intellectually engaged, a mother who read to her children and encouraged questions. This created an internal conflict within Adolf III. Should he emulate his father's stoic discipline or embrace his mother's emotional openness? The mansion demanded the former. His personality inclined toward the latter. This tension would never resolve, but external forces were about to test the entire family system. In 1916, the state of Colorado enacted prohibition, 4 full years before the federal 18th Amendment imposed nationwide alcohol bans in 1920. For a brewery, this was an existential threat. The product that generated all Coors' wealth was suddenly illegal to produce or sell within Colorado. Adolf I, now 74 years old, faced the greatest crisis of his business career. 4. Prohibition and the pivot that saved the empire. When Colorado banned alcohol production and sales in 1916, most breweries collapsed immediately. Their business model evaporated overnight. Equipment became worthless. Workers were laid off. Brewers either closed permanently, attempted to survive through illegal production, or converted facilities to manufacture legal products, often with little success. Adolf Coors chose transformation. He understood that beer was temporarily impossible. But the brewery's infrastructure, its buildings, its machinery, its workforce, its distribution, Network remained intact. The question was how to repurpose these assets. Adolf identified two opportunities. First, malted milk. During the World War I, demand for shelf-stable food products surged. Malted milk powder, a mixture of malted barley and powdered milk, was used in military rations and civilian confections. The Coors brewery already possessed the equipment and expertise to malt barley. Producing malted milk required only minor modifications. Adolf invested in the necessary changes and began producing Coors malted milk in 1917. The product sold well, particularly to candy manufacturers and soda fountain operators. Second, ceramics. This decision was more radical and more brilliant. Adolf learned that high-quality porcelain and ceramic materials could be produced from local Colorado clay deposits. Porcelain was essential for scientific and industrial applications, laboratory equipment, electrical insulators, industrial machinery components. Demand was growing, and American manufacturers were largely dependent on European imports, which the war had disrupted. Adolf saw an opening. In 1920, he established the Herald China and Pottery Company, later renamed Coors Porcelain Company, and eventually Coors-Tech. The venture required significant capital investment, approximately $500,000, equivalent to roughly $7.5 million today. True to form, Adolf paid cash. The ceramics operation was built on brewery grounds, adjacent to the beer production facilities. The same workers who had brewed beer now produced porcelain. The same management systems applied. This pivot was strategically brilliant. Adolf transformed an illegal brewery into a legal industrial operation without abandoning his core infrastructure. He maintained workforce expertise. He preserved the company's cash reserves. And he positioned Coors to survive prohibition economically intact, something fewer than half of American breweries managed. But survival came at psychological cost. Adolf Thumfern was a brewer. That was his identity. He had spent 50 years perfecting beer production. Malted milk and porcelain were profitable, but they were not his calling. The pride he took in brewing, the satisfaction of producing something excellent according to rigorous standards, was gone. He managed the new ventures competently, but joylessly. He was in his late 70s, watching his life's work legally prohibited. The mansion overlooking the brewery now overlooked factories producing industrial ceramics. The smell changed from fermentation to kiln firing. The workers wore different uniforms. The product was different. Everything was different except Adolf's insistence on control. He grew more withdrawn, more silent, more focused on his roses. Adolf II, now in his 30s, managed increasing operational responsibility. He had the education his father lacked. He understood chemistry and engineering at a sophisticated level. He improved production, efficiency. He expanded ceramic product lines. He was a capable executive. But he was not passionate. He performed duties. He met expectations. He did not innovate boldly or take risks. He managed what his father built. And during this period, inside the mansion, Adolf III was growing up. The boy was bright. He excelled academically at the local schools in Golden. He enjoyed outdoor activities, hiking, fishing, sports. He was well liked by peers. He displayed none of his grandfather's harshness or his father's reserve. He was, by all accounts, kind, friendly, normal. But he was also being groomed for a role he had not chosen. Every conversation about his future assumed he would join the brewery. Every educational decision was made with that destination in mind. He would attend college, study something business-related, then return to Golden and work under his father until eventually assuming leadership. This was not negotiable. The dynasty required continuity. Adolf III was the continuity. Alice Coors watched her oldest son being shaped by these pressures and worried. She encouraged him to read widely, to consider other paths, to think about what he wanted rather than what was expected. But her influence had limits. The mansion belonged to Adolf I even as he aged. The business belonged to Adolf II. Alice had carved out cultural space, but she could not alter the fundamental structure. Her son would inherit the brewery. That was decided before his birth. Then, in 1929, two things happened that changed everything. First, Adolf Hermann Joseph Coors. I died. He was 82 years old. He passed away inside the mansion on the brewery grounds, in the bedroom overlooking the factory he had built. Cause of death was listed as complications from old age. He had outlived most of his generation. He died without debt, without partners, and without apology. He had arrived in America as an illegal stowaway with nothing. He left behind an industrial empire worth millions of dollars and a family trained to continue his vision. His funeral was attended by hundreds of Colorado residents, brewery workers, and business associates. The local newspapers ran respectful obituaries celebrating his success and his contribution to Golden's economy. But the coverage was oddly impersonal. No warm anecdotes, no stories of generosity or kindness. Just facts. Immigrant, brewer, businessman, success. The absence of affection in the reporting mirrored the absence of affection in the man. Second, in October 1929, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression began. Adolf Coors II, now sole owner of the business, faced economic catastrophe. Consumer spending plummeted. Unemployment soared. Banks failed. Companies went bankrupt. The malted milk business contracted sharply as candy manufacturers cut production. The ceramics business survived. Industrial customers still needed insulators and laboratory equipment. But growth stopped. But because Adolf I had insisted on zero debt, the Coors Company had no loans to repay, no creditors demanding payment, no risk of foreclosure. The business could contract without collapsing. Workers were laid off, production was reduced, but the company endured. Adolf I's paranoia about debt saved his son during the worst economic crisis in American history. And then, in 1933, Prohibition ended. 5. The return of beer and the Golden Age. That hid growing pressure. The ratification of the 21st Amendment in December 1933 repealed federal prohibition. States were free to legalize alcohol again. Colorado acted quickly. By early 1934, brewing was legal once more. Adolf Coors II restarted beer production immediately. The brewery had been maintained throughout Prohibition. Equipment had been preserved, not dismantled. Workers who remembered brewing techniques were rehired. Within months, Coors beer was back on the market. The product remained unchanged from the pre-Prohibition formula. Pure barley malt, hops, rocky. Mountain water, yeast, no adjuncts, no shortcuts. And American consumers were thirsty. The 1930s and 1940s saw explosive growth for Coors. The brewery expanded production capacity multiple times. New fermentation tanks were installed, new bottling lines were added, distribution extended across the western states. The Coors name became synonymous with Colorado. The beer developed a regional mystique. The clean, crisp taste came from mountain water. The brewery was family-owned and independent. The product was pure. This was the beginning of the Coors legend. And legends are valuable. They sell beer. By 1940, Adolf Coors Brewing Company was producing over 300,000 barrels annually, generating revenues in the millions of dollars. Adolf II reinvested profits into infrastructure. The ceramics division continued growing separately, producing components for the burgeoning electronics industry. The Coors family was becoming genuinely wealthy, not just comfortable, but rich. The mansion on the brewery grounds underwent renovations. Plumbing was updated. Electrical systems were modernized. The decor remained conservative, but the house became more comfortable. Alice Coors finally had the resources to create a home environment that reflected her tastes. She commissioned local artists. She expanded the library. She hosted dinner parties for Denver's cultural elite, something Adolf Wein would have found intolerable. But the mansion was also becoming less central to family life. Adolf II built a separate, more modern home for his family in a residential neighborhood of Golden, away from the brewery. This was significant. For the first time, the family was separating from the factory. The house on brewery grounds remained the company headquarters and a symbol of the dynasty, but the family no longer lived inside it daily. This partial liberation from Adolf I's fortress suggested a loosening of the old control. Adolf III, now in his 20s, attended Cornell University, the same institution his father had attended. He studied business administration. He was competent but not exceptional academically. He participated in fraternity life. He made friends. He dated. He was, again, normal. He did not display his grandfather's intensity or his father's detachment. He was amiable, well-adjusted, unremarkable. And then came World War II. Adolf III enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1942. This decision was partially voluntary. He was of draft age and anticipated being called up, but it was also an escape. For the first time in his life, Adolf III left Colorado, left the brewery, left the family expectations. He served in the Pacific Theater, participating in campaigns in the Marshall Islands and Guam. He attained the rank of lieutenant. He saw combat. He experienced fear, boredom, camaraderie, and the arbitrary violence of war. Military service changed him. Not dramatically, he remained fundamentally the same person, but he gained perspective. He met men from across America who knew nothing about beer, nothing about Colorado, nothing about the Coors dynasty. To them, he was just another Marine. This anonymity was liberating. He was valued for his competence and character, not his last name. He returned to Colorado in 1945 with a Marine Corps honorable discharge and a clear understanding that he would now enter the family business permanently. There had been a brief window where another life was possible. That window closed when he came home. In 1940, before enlisting, Adolf III had married Mary Urquhart Grant, the daughter of a prominent Denver family. Mary was educated, socially connected, and gracious. She understood the role of a brewery heir's wife. She would manage the household, raise the children, and support her husband's career. This was standard for women of her class and era. She performed these roles competently and without public complaint. Adolf III and Mary had 4 children: Adolf Coors Forsch, born 1943, James, born 1945, Joseph, born 1947, and May, born 1950. The family lived in a large house in Denver, not on brewery grounds. Adolf III commuted to Golden for work. The physical separation from the factory that his father had begun was now complete. The dynasty was wealthy enough to afford distance. Adolf III joined the Coors Company as an executive in 1946. He worked under his father, learning operations, management, and sales. In 1954, Adolf II made him president of the brewery. Adolf Thum remained chairman of the board, retaining ultimate authority, but day-to-day operations became Adolf III's responsibility. He was 44 years old. He had trained for this role his entire life. By 1960, Adolf Coors Brewing Company was producing over 3 million barrels of beer annually. It was the 8th largest brewery in America. Revenue exceeded $100 million per year. The company employed over 1,500 workers. The ceramics division, now called Coors. Porcelain was a separate multi-million-dollar business. The Coors family wealth was conservatively estimated at over $50 million, roughly equivalent to $500 million today. Adolf III was, by any external measure, extraordinarily successful. He was president of a thriving company. He lived in a beautiful home. He had a devoted wife and 4 healthy children. He was financially secure beyond measure. He had everything. And on February 9, 1960, he drove his International Harvester Travelall station wagon toward the brewery, alone, unguarded, following the same route he drove every morning. A yellow Mercury sedan blocked the road near Turkey Creek Bridge. A man with a gun stepped out, and everything the Coors dynasty had built across 3 generations, the control, the discipline, the fortress, the empire, meant nothing. 6. The morning everything collapsed, February 9, 1960. Adolf Coors III kissed his wife Mary goodbye at approximately 7:45 in the morning. He was dressed in a business suit, wearing his trademark horn-rimmed glasses. His plan was ordinary: drive from his Denver home to the brewery in Golden, a route he had driven thousands of times. The distance was roughly 12 miles. Travel time was typically 25 minutes. He drove a 1960 International Harvester Travelall, a large, boxy station wagon, practical rather than luxurious. This choice was characteristic of Adolf III. Despite his wealth, he avoided ostentation. He could have driven a Cadillac or Lincoln. He chose a workhorse vehicle. This decision, intended to project humility, may have made him a more attractive target. The car announced that its driver was not security conscious, not paranoid, not expecting threats. The route took him west on U.S. Highway 40 through the foothills southwest of Denver. The road wound through canyons and over ridges. Traffic was light in the early morning. The area was sparsely populated: rocky terrain, scrub vegetation, occasional ranches. One landmark along the route was Turkey Creek Bridge, a narrow wooden structure crossing a small mountain stream. The bridge was unremarkable: 2 lanes, no guardrails, wooden planks over a steel frame. Drivers crossed it without noticing, but someone had been noticing it for weeks. At approximately 8:10 in the morning, a passing milk truck driver named Elmer C. Huntley noticed a vehicle stopped on Turkey Creek Bridge, blocking 1 lane. The engine was running. The driver's door was open. Nobody was visible. Huntley slowed. He saw a man's hat on the floor of the front seat. He saw dark stains on the door upholstery. He saw broken eyeglasses on the ground near the bridge. He drove to the nearest telephone and called the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived at 8:30. What they found was a crime scene that told a simple, brutal story. Adolf Coors III's International Harvester was stopped diagonally across the bridge, engine idling, keys in. The ignition, driver's door open. A brown Stetson rancher's hat, Adolf's hat, was lying on the front floor. Blood was smeared on the interior door panel and driver's seat. More blood was on the bridge railing. The eyeglasses found near the car were confirmed as Adolf's prescription. 1 lens was cracked. Tire tracks indicated that another vehicle, later determined to be a 1951 Mercury sedan, had blocked the International Harvester, forcing it to stop. Witnesses who lived near the bridge later reported seeing a bright yellow Mercury parked near the area on multiple occasions in the days preceding the kidnapping. The driver had been observed sitting in the car for extended periods, watching traffic. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was planned. The kidnapper had studied Adolf's schedule. He knew Adolf drove alone. He knew Adolf drove the same route daily. He knew Adolf was wealthy. He knew Adolf would be vulnerable at this isolated location. The Turkey Creek Bridge was perfect, minimal traffic, no nearby homes, surrounded by rough terrain that discouraged pursuit. The kidnapper had chosen his hunting ground carefully. Adolf was gone. No body, no ransom note, just blood and broken glasses. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office immediately contacted the Denver Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A kidnapping case involving a multimillionaire was automatically a federal matter. By afternoon, FBI agents were on the scene. By evening, J. Edgar Hoover himself had been briefed. The Coors family was notified within hours. Mary Coors was told that her husband had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Adolf II was informed at the brewery. The family gathered at the mansion on the brewery grounds, the same building where Adolf I had raised his children in silence. Now it became a command center for a kidnapping investigation. The FBI took control of the case. They established two priorities. First, find Adolf III alive if possible. Second, identify and capture the kidnapper. Agents began interviewing everyone who knew Adolf, mapping his routines, identifying potential enemies. They quickly ruled out business rivals. The beer industry was competitive, but not violent. They considered disgruntled employees. The brewery had over 1,500 workers, and labor relations were sometimes tense, but found no plausible suspects. The focus shifted to ransom. Kidnappers want money. Adolf III's family was worth tens of millions of dollars. A ransom demand was expected. On February 11th, 2 days after the disappearance, a typed ransom note arrived at the Coors residence. The letter demanded $500,000 in small, unmarked bills. Instructions for delivery would follow. The letter provided proof of life, details about Adolf's clothing and possessions that only the kidnapper could know. The note warned that contacting police would result in Adolf's death. The FBI examined the note. The typewriter used was identified as a Remington Portable. The paper was cheap, generic, available at any stationery store. The wording was blunt, grammatically competent, but not sophisticated. The writer was educated, but not literary. The demands were precise: specific denominations, specific packaging, specific delivery methods. This indicated planning. The kidnapper had thought through logistics. Mary Coors and Adolf II agreed to pay the ransom. Money was irrelevant. They wanted Adolf III back. The FBI advised cooperation while simultaneously intensifying their investigation. Agents traced recent purchases of Remington typewriters. They interviewed owners of yellow Mercury sedans. They searched for the bridge crime scene. On February 15th, the kidnapper's abandoned Mercury was discovered in Atlantic City, New Jersey, over 1,700 miles from Colorado. This was the first major break. The car had been purchased in Denver under a false name weeks before the kidnapping. Inside the trunk, investigators found handcuffs, rope, a canvas bag, and a second Remington typewriter. Fingerprints were lifted from multiple surfaces. The FBI ran the prints through their database. They got a match. Joseph Corbett, Jr., 41 years old, a convicted murderer who had been paroled from California State Prison in 1956 after serving 11 years for killing another man during an armed robbery. Corbett had moved to Denver after parole, living under an assumed identity. He had worked menial jobs, lived in cheap apartments, and aroused no suspicion. He was intelligent. His IQ had been measured at over 130, but deeply antisocial. Psychologists who evaluated him during his imprisonment described him as narcissistic, resentful, and devoid of empathy. Corbett fit the profile perfectly. He needed money. He had no moral constraints. He was capable of violence. And he hated people like Adolf Coors III, wealthy, privileged, born into advantages Corbett would never have. The FBI issued a nationwide warrant. Corbett's photograph was circulated to every law enforcement agency in the country. The media reported the story extensively. Adolf Coors III's kidnapping became front-page news. Americans followed the case obsessively. But Adolf himself remained missing. On February 17th, 8 days after the kidnapping, ransom delivery instructions arrived. The Coors family was told to place the $500,000 in a specific location outside Denver. FBI agents prepared the money, genuine currency mixed with marked bills and recording devices. They planned to arrest Corbett during the pickup. But Corbett never appeared. Hours passed. The drop location remained undisturbed. No contact was made. The FBI realized something had gone wrong. 7. The body, the trial, and the verdict that answered. Nothing. On September 12, 1960, 7 months after the kidnapping, a hiker discovered human remains on a remote hillside approximately 20 miles south of Turkey Creek Bridge. The body was partially skeletonized, burned, and decomposed. Clothing fragments matched Adolf Coors III's attire. Dental records confirmed identity. Adolf Coors III had been dead since February 9th, probably within hours of the kidnapping. Forensic examination indicated that Adolf died from 2 gunshot wounds to the back. The shots were fired at close range. He had been killed execution style, likely shortly after being forced from his vehicle at Turkey Creek Bridge. The kidnapper had never intended to collect a ransom, or had panicked immediately after the abduction, or had killed Adolf accidentally during a struggle and then fled. The motive remained unclear. The method was clear. Adolf had been murdered for $500,000 he never had the chance to deliver. Mary Coors was informed. Adolf II was informed. The family buried Adolf III in a private ceremony. The brewery issued a public statement mourning the loss of its president. Newspapers reported the death with shock and sadness. The story resonated nationally. A wealthy businessman, beloved father, decorated Marine veteran, murdered by an ex-convict for money. It confirmed every fear wealthy Americans harbored about vulnerability and violence. Joseph Corbett, Jr. remained at large. The FBI's manhunt intensified. Corbett's photograph appeared on the newly created FBI 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. Tips poured in from across the country. Alleged sightings were reported in California, Texas, Canada, Mexico. All proved false. Corbett had disappeared as thoroughly as Adolf once had. Then, in October 1960, Canadian authorities arrested a man matching Corbett's description in Vancouver, British Columbia. He was living under an alias, working as a mechanic. He had over $7,000 in cash, a suspicious amount for a transient worker. Canadian police contacted the FBI. Fingerprints confirmed identity. Joseph Corbett, Jr. was extradited to Colorado in November 1960. His trial began in March 1961. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the yellow mercury, the typewriter, the fingerprints, the ransom notes, the proximity to the crime scene. Corbett's defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial. There were no witnesses to the murder itself, no confession, no direct proof that Corbett pulled the trigger. The attorney suggested that someone else could have used Corbett's car, planted his fingerprints, framed him. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty. First-degree murder. Sentencing followed immediately. Colorado law allowed the death penalty for first-degree murder. The prosecution requested execution, but the judge imposed life imprisonment without possibility of parole instead. The reasoning was practical, not merciful. Adolf's body had been too badly decomposed to conclusively determine cause of death. The gunshot wounds were probable, but not absolutely certain. This sliver of doubt prevented a death sentence. Joseph Corbett, Jr. was sent to Cannon City, Colorado, to serve life in the Colorado State Penitentiary. He never confessed. He never explained. He never expressed remorse. In the decades that followed, Corbett was interviewed multiple times by journalists, psychologists, and parole boards. He consistently maintained that he was innocent, that he had been framed, that the evidence was planted. He offered no alternative theory. He refused to discuss Adolf Coors III. He showed no emotion when questioned about the family. Psychologists who evaluated him concluded that he was a classic sociopath, intelligent, manipulative, devoid of conscience. He understood intellectually that killing was wrong, but he did not feel that it was wrong. He had killed Adolf Coors III because Adolf represented something Corbett wanted and could never have: wealth, status, family, respect. The murder was partly financial, partly psychological. Adolf's death gave Corbett a momentary sense of power over the class that had always excluded him. But the ransom was never collected. The money Adolf represented remained untouchable. Corbett fled with a few $1,000s stolen from other sources. He destroyed his own life to kill a man whose wealth he could not access. The crime was as irrational as it was brutal. Joseph Corbett, Jr. died in prison in 2009 at age 81, having served nearly 50 years. He was never paroled. He died unrepentant. 8. The Mansion. After the murder. What the Coors dynasty became. Adolf Coors. Thur's murder shattered the illusion of control that the family had maintained for 3 generations. Adolf I had built a fortress. He had accumulated wealth without debt. He had integrated family and business into one surveilled, disciplined system. He had believed that rigorous control could protect against chaos. His grandson's murder proved otherwise. Control meant nothing when a man with a gun decided to act. Money meant nothing when a sociopath chose violence. The fortress had no walls high enough to stop a bullet. Adolf II, now 77 years old, was devastated. He had lost his son. He had failed to protect him. The business continued. Beer production did not stop, but Adolf II withdrew from public life. He remained chairman of the board in name, but delegated most authority to other executives. He spent his remaining years quietly, avoiding attention. He died in 1970, 10 years after his son's murder, having never recovered emotionally. The brewery itself entered a period of transformation. The third generation, Adolf IV, Joseph, and William, took over management in the 1970s. They modernized operations, expanded distribution, and eventually made Coors a national brand. The company went public in 1975, selling stock to outside investors for the first time in its history. This violated Adolf III's principle of absolute private ownership, but the brothers deemed it necessary for growth. By the 1980s, Coors was one of the largest breweries in America, competing directly with Anheuser-Busch and Miller. The regional mystique was replaced by mass marketing. The family remained wealthy and influential, but the business was no longer a private empire. It was a corporation. The mansion on the brewery grounds was eventually converted into company offices. Family members no longer lived there. The building that Adolf IV designed as a home became an administrative facility. Tours were occasionally offered to visitors, showcasing the brewery's history. But the psychological weight of the place remained. Employees who worked in the mansion reported feeling uncomfortable in the building. The silence, the dark paneling, the smell of old wood and malt, the weight of history. The mansion became a monument to the family's past rather than its present. Adolf Coors IV, the oldest son of Adolf III, the great-grandson of the founder, eventually left the beer business entirely. He became an evangelical Christian and spent much of his adult life as a public speaker, discussing his father's murder and his own struggles with anger and faith. He wrote a memoir describing his childhood, his father's death, and his journey toward forgiveness. He publicly forgave Joseph Corbett, Jr., though Corbett never acknowledged the gesture. This represents a complete inversion of Adolf III's philosophy. The patriarch had demanded control, silence, and discipline. His great-grandson embraced vulnerability, speech, and emotional openness. The dynasty that began with an orphaned German immigrant obsessed with self-sufficiency ended with a man who found meaning through faith and forgiveness. The Coors Brewing Company merged with Molson in 2005, becoming Molson Coors Brewing Company. The family retained ownership stakes, but no longer controlled operations. The brewery in Golden, Colorado, remains one of the largest in the world, producing millions of barrels annually. Tourists visit the facility, taste the beer, and learn sanitized versions of the family history. They are not told about the silent dinners, the winter garden where a man loved roses more than his children, the heating pipes connected to the factory boilers, the surveillance from the second-floor bedroom, the pressure that shaped 3 generations, the yellow mercury on the bridge, They are told about success, immigration, entrepreneurship, the American dream. But the mansion knows better. 9. The deeper story. What the Coors mansion reveals about wealth and control. The Coors mansion was never just a house. It was a physical embodiment of a belief system, the belief that wealth and control are the same thing. That if you accumulate enough money, enforce enough discipline, and maintain enough vigilance, you can protect yourself and your family from the chaos of the world. Adolf Coors. I believe this absolutely. He arrived in America with nothing. He built an empire through relentless effort and paranoid caution. He refused debt because debt meant dependency. He refused partners because partners meant compromise. He built his home on his factory grounds because separation meant vulnerability. He enforced silence at meals because speech meant disorder. Every decision was designed to maximize control. And it worked. Financially, the business prospered. The family accumulated wealth. The empire endured prohibition, the Depression, and war. By conventional measures, Adolf Thur's philosophy was vindicated. He proved that an immigrant could succeed through intelligence and discipline. But control is not safety, and wealth is not protection. Adolf III inherited everything his grandfather built. He inherited the business, the mansion, the money, the legacy. He was raised to continue the dynasty. He was educated, competent, responsible. He fulfilled every expectation. He became president of the brewery. He married well. He had children. He succeeded. And none of it mattered on Turkey Creek Bridge. The mansion could not protect him. The money could not protect him. The control could not protect him. A man with a gun and a plan reduced 3 generations of accumulated wealth to irrelevance in 5 minutes. Adolf III died alone on a hillside, shot in the back, his body burned and hidden. The empire continued without him. This is the uncomfortable truth the Coors story reveals. Wealth creates the illusion of control, but it does not grant actual control. Rich people are still mortal, still vulnerable, still subject to chance and violence. They can build walls, hire security, accumulate resources. But they cannot eliminate risk. They cannot guarantee safety. And the psychological burden of believing they can, of living inside a fortress that promises protection but delivers isolation, is crushing. Adolf Thur's mansion was a fortress that became a cage. His grandchildren were wealthy but trapped. They lived under expectations they did not choose, in roles they did not design, serving a business they inherited rather than built. They were heirs, not creators, and heirs are prisoners of legacy. Adolf III's murder exposed this. He was not killed because he was evil or cruel. He was killed because he was rich and accessible. His wealth made him a target. His lack of security made him vulnerable. His routine, driving alone on a predictable route, made him easy to ambush. The qualities that made him relatable and unpretentious also made him killable. And the killer? Joseph Corbett Jr. was not a monster. He was a sociopath, which is different. He was intelligent, calculating, and emotionally hollow. He looked at Adolf Coors III and saw not a person, but a symbol, a representation of everything Corbett lacked and resented. Adolf had been born into privilege. Corbett had been born into poverty. Adolf's life had been smooth and prosperous. Corbett's life had been brutal and punishing. Adolf's name meant something. Corbett's name meant nothing. So Corbett took Adolf's life, not for ransom, he never collected the money, but for the act itself, for the momentary sense of power, for revenge against the class system that had excluded him. The murder was nihilistic. It achieved nothing. But it satisfied something in Corbett. It made him, briefly, the one in control. This is what wealth does. It creates resentment. It marks people as targets. It separates them from the society that produces their riches. Adolf I understood this instinctively, which is why he built his fortress. But he misunderstood the solution. Isolation does not create safety. It creates strangeness. It makes you alien. And people fear and resent aliens. The mansion stood for decades as a symbol of success. But it was also a tomb. The people inside were wealthy, but they were not free. They lived under surveillance, their grandfather's eyes, their father's expectations, the workers' gaze, the public scrutiny. They breathed factory air. They ate silent meals. They learned to suppress themselves. And when Adolf III finally escaped, when he went to war, when he started his own family, when he built his own home away from the brewery, it was too late. He was still the heir. He still drove to the brewery every morning. He still fulfilled his role. And the role killed him. 10. Legacy, memory, and the mansion that stands. Today, the mansion still exists. It stands on the grounds of the Molson Coors Brewery in Golden, Colorado. The building has been maintained, renovated, and converted for corporate use. Offices occupy the rooms where Adolf thus raised his children. Conference rooms fill the spaces where silent dinners once occurred. Employees park in lots where Adolf once observed workers from his bedroom window. The brewery offers public tours. Visitors walk through production facilities, learn about brewing techniques, and taste samples in a hospitality center. The tour occasionally mentions the mansion, describing it as the founder's home, a piece of company history. The narrative is positive. Immigrant success, family, tradition, American entrepreneurship. The murders are not mentioned. The silence is not mentioned. The control is not mentioned. The roses are not mentioned. History, when told by corporations, becomes mythology. The uncomfortable parts are edited out. The contradictions are smoothed over. The story becomes inspirational rather than cautionary. Visitors leave feeling good about beer and capitalism, unaware of the psychological machinery that operated inside the mansion for a century. But the building remembers. Architecture holds memory differently than people do. A house absorbs the routines and emotions of its inhabitants. The Coors mansion absorbed silence, discipline, and surveillance. It absorbed the smell of fermentation and the sound of machinery. It absorbed the psychological pressure of dynastic expectations. Those things do not disappear when the function changes. They linger. Employees who work in the building report odd feelings. Not ghosts, nothing supernatural, just discomfort, a sense of being watched, an awareness of weight. The building is too quiet, too heavy. The rooms do not feel welcoming despite modern lighting and furniture. People avoid spending unnecessary time there. They hold meetings, then leave. This is not imagination. This is the emotional residue of history. The mansion was designed for control, and control leaves traces. The architecture enforces hierarchy. The layout prioritizes observation. The materials, thick walls, dark wood, heavy doors, insulate and isolate. Even repurposed, the building retains its original psychological function. The mansion is a monument, not to success, but to the costs of success. Not to wealth, but to what wealth demands from its custodians. It stands as a physical reminder that accumulation is not the same as fulfillment, that empire building extracts a price from builders and heirs alike, that fortresses do not protect, they imprison. Adolf Coors. I wanted to create something permanent. I succeeded. The company bearing his name produces millions of barrels of beer annually, employs thousands of workers, and generates billions of dollars in revenue. His descendants remain wealthy and influential. The mansion still stands. The legacy endures. But at what cost? Adolf I lived alone in his mind, unable to connect emotionally with the people around him. His son, Adolf II, lived under impossible expectations, managing an empire he never chose. His grandson, Adolf III, lived and died fulfilling a role assigned before his birth, murdered on a bridge while driving to work at a job he inherited. 3 generations, enormous wealth, absolute control, And in the end, none of it mattered. The mansion could not protect them. The money could not save them. The control could not prevent chaos. This is the lesson of the Coors mansion. Wealth is not safety. Control is not freedom. Legacy is not fulfillment. And the things we build to protect ourselves often become the prisons that confine us. The mansion stands, silent, heavy, watchful, a monument to ambition, a tomb for dreams, a fortress that failed. Conclusion: the heir who died, fulfilling a destiny he never chose. On February 9, 1960, Adolf Coors III kissed his wife goodbye, climbed into his station wagon, and drove toward the brewery his grandfather built. He was 44 years old. He was wealthy beyond measure. He was president of a thriving company. He was a decorated veteran, a devoted father, a respected member of his community. He was also trapped, not by physical walls, but by expectations, by the weight of a legacy that began in 1873 when a penniless German orphan tasted mountain water and saw opportunity, by the mansion on the brewery grounds where silence reigned at dinner, by the dynasty that required continuity, by the role of heir which demands everything and offers no escape. Adolf III fulfilled that role until the moment a yellow mercury blocked his path on Turkey Creek Bridge. And then the role ended. Abruptly, violently, finally, his murder solved nothing. It avenged nothing. It accomplished nothing except the destruction of two lives, his own and Joseph Corbett Jr.'s. The Coors Company continued. The family continued. The mansion continued. The only thing that stopped was Adolf III's heartbeat. This is the darkest truth of dynastic wealth. Individuals are expendable. The empire matters more than any single heir. Adolf III was mourned, buried, and replaced. The business did not pause. Production did not stop. A new president was appointed. Life went on, because the mansion was never really about the people inside it. It was about the business outside it. Adolf III built his home on the factory grounds not to integrate family and work, but to subordinate family to work. The house was a dormitory for workers in the dynastic project. The family members were employees of the empire, paid in comfort, but compensated with expectations. Adolf III paid the ultimate price for membership in this system. He inherited wealth, status, and power. He also inherited vulnerability. His name made him a target. His routine made him accessible. His isolation, the psychological isolation created by the mansion's culture of silence and control, prevented him from seeking protection or imagining danger. He died because his grandfather built a fortress that taught his descendants they were safe. They were not safe. They were just wealthy. And wealth without wisdom, without connection, without freedom, is simply another form of captivity. The Coors mansion stands today as a reminder of this truth. Tourists visit the brewery and see success. Employees work in the mansion and feel discomfort. Historians study the family and find tragedy. And on Turkey Creek Bridge, where the crime occurred, there is no marker, no plaque, no memorial. Just a narrow wooden bridge over a shallow creek, unremarkable except for what happened there. Drivers cross it without knowing. The landscape does not remember. Only the archives remember. Only the mansion remembers. Adolf Coors III drove across that bridge thousands of times. He drove across it one final time on February 9, 1960. He did not know it would be his last trip. He was simply going to work, fulfilling his duty, playing his assigned role in the family narrative. The role killed him, and the mansion, silent and heavy and watchful, absorbed one more tragedy into its walls. Another generation sacrificed to the empire, another heir consumed by the system built to protect him. This is the story of the Coors mansion, not a story of beer, but a dissection of wealth, not a celebration of success, but an examination of cost, not a myth of the American dream, but a cautionary tale about the cages we build from money, control, and expectations. The mansion still stands. The empire continues. The beer still flows. But inside the walls, where Adolf I once raised his children in silence, where Adolf III learned to suppress himself, there is only emptiness. Offices, conference rooms, corporate functions. The people are gone. The dynasty has transformed into a corporation. The family legacy has become a brand. And on a hillside 20 miles south of Turkey Creek Bridge, where hikers found Adolf Coors III's body in September 1960, the earth holds the final secret that all the control in the world cannot stop a bullet, that all the wealth in the world cannot buy safety, that all the discipline in the world cannot prevent chaos. The mansion promised protection. It delivered isolation. The dynasty promised continuity. It delivered pressure. The wealth promised freedom. It delivered captivity. Adolf Coors III lived his entire life inside this system. He fulfilled every expectation. He played his role perfectly, and it killed him. The mansion stands, silent witness to 100 years of ambition, control, and tragedy. A monument built by an immigrant who had everything except the ability to love without conditions. A fortress that became a cage. A home that became a tomb. And every day, trucks leave the brewery carrying beer to markets across America. The Coors name remains famous. The company remains profitable. The legacy endures. But inside the mansion where it all began, there is only silence. The same silence that Adolf IV demanded at dinner. The same silence that Adolf III learned to carry inside himself. The same silence that now fills the empty rooms where a dynasty once lived, suffered, and ultimately destroyed itself in the pursuit of control it could never truly possess.